I have kept this inside me for 53 years. Carried it the way you carry a stone in your shoe, not heavy enough to stop you walking, but present every single step until you stop noticing it as something separate from yourself and start to believe it is simply the way walking feels. I am 79 years old, white-haired. I shuffle when I walk because my knee was broken badly 40 years ago and healed wrong, and nobody here cared enough to see it healed properly. I sit in the corner of the room they've given me, and I read when the light is good, and I think when it isn't. Nobody knows what I want to talk about today, not my sister, who visited twice in the early years and stopped. Not the chaplain who asks after my soul with the practiced concern of a man doing his job. What I did, the thing that brought me here, that is known. That is a matter of public record. That is the reason I have spent 53 years inside walls. But the thing I regret most is not that. It is something else entirely. Something the judge didn't ask about, something the newspapers never asked about with their careful language of shock and moral satisfaction. They thought they knew the whole story. They didn't know the half of it. I was born in Virginia in the spring of 1843. My mother said the dogwood was in flower when I came into the world. She was a woman who read signs in things. When you have very little control over what happens to you, you look for patterns. You look for evidence that the universe might occasionally favor you. That is the soil I grew in, and the soil matters. Nobody becomes what I became without a road behind them. The road behind me was long and it was not gentle, and most of the people who judged me had never walked a single mile of it. My father's name was Edmund Crail. He was a carpenter by trade, a drinker by habit, and a violent man on the occasions when those two things combined with whatever particular darkness lived in him that I never fully understood, and stopped trying to understand when I was about 9 years old. He was not always violent. That is the thing about such men that is hardest to explain to people who haven't lived with one. They are not always violent. Sometimes weeks would go by, good weeks, almost ordinary weeks, weeks where he came home from work in reasonable spirits, ate his supper, spoke to us with something approaching kindness, and went to bed without incident. Those weeks were almost worse than the bad ones in a certain way, because they gave you hope, and hope in that house was a dangerous thing to cultivate. My mother was Margaret Crail, born Margaret Holt, from a family in the Shenandoah Valley. She was small and dark-haired and quicker-minded than anyone gave her credit for, because quick-minded women in that time and place were not encouraged to advertise the fact. She had married my father at 17 because her own father had decided it was a good match, and she had been paying for that decision ever since. She never complained about it, never spoke against my father in words. But I watched her. I was a watching child, the kind who sits quietly in corners and takes in everything and processes it much later in the dark. I watched my mother's face when my father walked through the door. The way her eyes assessed him in that first second, the way she went either slightly softer or slightly more careful, depending on what she saw. She had learned to read him the way sailors read weather. Survival had made her an expert. I had 3 siblings. James, who was 4 years older than me and who left home at 16 and sent letters back irregularly for a few years before the letters stopped entirely. Louisa, a year younger than me, who was gentle in the way that gentle people are when the world hasn't beaten it out of them yet. And the baby, Daniel, who died of scarlet fever when he was 3 and I was 7, and whose absence was another small hole in the fabric of our family that we never spoke about and never entirely stopped feeling. We were poor, not the romantic kind of poor that stories sometimes make of poverty, not the kind with warmth and laughter and community to soften the edges, the grinding kind, the kind where the cold comes through the walls in winter and you are never entirely warm, where the question of what there is to eat is a real question and not always answered satisfactorily, where your shoes have cardboard inside them because the soles are through and there is no money for new ones. That kind of poor. The kind that wears you down slowly and makes you old before your time and teaches you, without ever saying it in so many words, that you are not one of the people the world was designed to accommodate. You are one of the people the world expects to manage without. I learned to read at the church school, learned it ferociously, desperately, the way hungry children eat when food is suddenly put in front of them. I read everything I could find, newspapers, the Bible, a collection of improving tracts the minister gave out. A novel that one of the older girls at school lent me once, which I read so many times the pages came loose. Reading was the only door I could see that might open onto a different kind of life. I did not know then how many things would have to happen before I could walk through it, or what the walking would cost. I was 12 years old the night my father broke my mother's arm. I heard it from my room, the crack of it, and then the sound she made, and then his voice, low and ugly with drink, telling her to stop making noise. I lay in the dark and I did not go in. I want you to understand that. I did not go in. I pulled the blanket over my head and lay there while my mother was on the other side of that wall, and I did not go in. That is one of the things I have lived with. Not the thing I am going to talk about, not the worst thing, but one of the things. The next morning my father was at the table eating his breakfast as though nothing had happened. My mother moved around the kitchen with her arm held against her body at a careful angle, her face showing nothing, making biscuits with one hand. She didn't go to a doctor, couldn't afford one, and besides, what would she have said? She set the arm herself as best she could against the table edge, with me helping to hold it because Louisa was too frightened. I was 12. She told me what to do and I did it. I held her arm steady while she pushed it back into alignment, and when she cried out, I held on anyway, because she told me to hold on, and I had learned that when my mother told you to do a thing in that particular voice, there was no hesitation in it, you just did it. She healed wrong. Her left arm never straightened fully after that. She carried that slightly crooked arm for the rest of her life, holding it a little away from her body when she stood still, like a bird with a wing that wouldn't quite close. Nobody outside our house ever remarked on it. Nobody asked. People did not ask in those days about the private arrangements of families. What happened inside a man's house was his business. That was the law, and it was the custom, and it was the air everyone breathed, and nobody thought to question it. I questioned it. Even at 12, I questioned it, though I had no language for the questioning yet, and nowhere to put what I felt. What I felt was a fury so deep and so constant it had become like the cold, just part of the climate, just the temperature of my inner world. I was furious at my father. I was furious at the world that allowed men like my father to do what they did without consequence. And I was furious, God help me, at my mother for staying. I am ashamed of that anger now. I understand now what she had, what she could have gone to, and what would have happened to us children. I understand that her staying was not weakness, but an impossible calculation, made over and over again under conditions I can barely imagine. I understand all of that now. At 12, I just felt the fury, and the fury had to go somewhere. It went into silence, mostly, into the watching and the waiting and the careful, patient storing up of everything I observed, into becoming a girl that nobody looked at twice because she was so quiet, so unremarkable, so perfectly still, into the reading, into the long nights lying awake building, brick by brick, an interior life so rich and so completely my own that no one could touch it. That was where I lived, inside that interior life, while my exterior life went on around me like weather happening to someone else. I swore to myself, lying in that bed in that house, with the cold coming through the wall and my father's snoring on one side of it and my mother's careful silence on the other. I swore that I would not live like this, that I would find a way out, that I would build something different. I was 12 years old and I did not know yet what building something different would require, what it would cost, what I would find inside myself when things got desperate enough. If I had known, I wonder sometimes if I would have made the same promise, if I would have had the courage to try, but I didn't know. So I promised. The way out, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Robert Sayers. I was 19 years old. He was 31. He came to the town where we lived to manage the books for a dry goods merchant, a man named Haverford, who had a large operation on the main street. Robert was from Richmond. He wore clean clothes and spoke in complete sentences, and read books for pleasure, and had opinions about things beyond the weather and the price of corn. In my world, in the world I had grown up in, he might as well have come from another country. I met him at a church social in the spring of 1862. He asked me what I was reading. Not many people in that room would have asked that. Not many people in that room would have assumed a girl like me was reading anything. I was reading Dickens. He said he preferred Thackeray. We argued about it pleasantly for half an hour, and I walked home that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time, possibly had never felt with this particular quality. I felt visible. Genuinely visible, not as a daughter or a poor man's child or a girl to be assessed for marriageability or a quiet creature who could be ignored, just visible, as a mind, as a person with thoughts worth engaging. I should have been more careful. I know that now. When you have been starved of something for a very long time and someone holds it out to you, you reach for it without checking what it will cost you. That's not a weakness, that's just being human. But it meant I didn't see what I should have seen about Robert Sayers early enough to protect myself. We courted for 8 months. He was attentive and intelligent and could make me laugh in a way that nobody else had ever made me laugh. From somewhere real, not the polite social laughter that women performed. He spoke to me about books and about ideas and about the war that was consuming everything around us and about his plans, which were ambitious in a way I found electrifying. He wanted to go west eventually, said the country was opening up, said a man with his skills could build something real if he got to the right place at the right time. He made the future sound like a place we could actually go. I had never thought of the future that way before. I had always thought of it as simply more of the present, more of the same cold walls and the same fury and the same making do. He asked my father for permission to marry me in January of 1863. My father, who had never done anything for me in his life that I had not paid for somehow, said yes immediately, said Robert was a man of prospects, said I was lucky. The word landed in me like a stone dropped in still water, and the rings from it spread outward through everything. Lucky. I was 20 years old and about to marry a man I had known for 8 months, during a war, in a world that had shown me exactly what marriage could mean for a woman, and I was called lucky. I married him anyway, not because my father said I was lucky, not because Robert was my only option. I married him because I had looked at my options honestly, and he was the best one I could see, and because I genuinely believed at 20 years old that the connection between us was real enough to build on. Maybe it was. I have thought about that for 53 years, and I still don't know the answer. The first year of marriage was not bad. We had a small house, 3 rooms, which Robert kept clean because he had a dislike of disorder that I initially found reassuring after the chaos of my childhood. He was not warm exactly, but he was consistent. And consistency was something I had been starved of for so long that I mistook it for safety. He was not cruel to me, not in those first months. He was precise. He had very particular ideas about how a household should be run, how a wife should conduct herself, how money should be spent and accounted for. Very particular ideas, held with a certainty that left no room for discussion. But they were communicated with words, not fists. And in my experience of man, that was a significant distinction. I learned his systems, adapted myself to them, kept the house the way he wanted it kept, cooked the food he preferred, managed the household accounts to his specifications, presented myself in public in the way he considered appropriate for his wife. I was good at adapting. A childhood like mine teaches you that. You learn to read what the room needs and become it. The cost of that learning is that after a while you're not entirely sure what you would be if you stopped adapting, what's underneath, whether anything is underneath. I wrote letters to Louisa, visited my mother when Robert permitted it, which was not often. He disliked my family, found them beneath the social station he was constructing for himself. He never said this in words that I could have objected to. He said it in the way he looked when I mentioned visiting them, in the length of time he took to respond when I asked permission, in the subtle withdrawal of warmth in the days following any visit I did make. I learned to ask less often, and then less often still, and then barely at all. The war ended in 1865. Robert had not fought in it. He had a chest complaint, or said he did, and had managed to avoid service through the early years and then through the later years on the basis of being essential to the merchant's operations. I have no opinion about that. Men made their choices about the war in ways that are not mine to judge. But when it ended, Robert was more restless than he had been before. The West he had spoken of, the future he had described, he began to talk about it again with more urgency, said the time had come, said there was money to be made if you moved fast enough. I was pregnant, 4 months pregnant with our first child. I told him this when he said we should start making plans to move. He looked at me for a long moment, and something crossed his face that I catalogued carefully without reacting to it on the outside. He said we would wait until after the baby came. He said it reasonably. He said it as though it were a practical calculation and not the beginning of something. Our son was born in the spring of 1866. We named him Thomas. He was healthy and loud and had his father's coloring in my mother's eyes, which I took as a sign in the way my mother had taught me to look for signs. I loved him with a ferocity that surprised me. I had not known I was capable of that kind of love, the kind with no conditions attached, no calculation behind it, no survival strategy embedded in it, just love, plain and total, with nowhere to go but into this child. That love saved me later. That is what I believe. That love was the thing that kept me from becoming something even worse than what I became. The change in Robert happened gradually and then all at once, the way certain catastrophes work. The gradual part was years of small tightenings, less money available to me for the household without explanation, less freedom of movement, less permission to see my mother or Louisa, more criticism of my conduct and my appearance and my management of Thomas's upbringing, more of that cold withdrawal of warmth that he used the way other men use their fists. It was effective. I will say that for it. It is a surprisingly effective tool, coldness. It leaves no marks. Nobody can point to it. Nobody can say you did this thing on this day, in this place. And there is evidence. It just erodes you. Day by day and month by month, it erodes you. And you don't notice how far the erosion has gone until you try to remember who you were before it started and find the memory blurred. The all-at-once part came in 1874. Thomas was 8. I was 31. Robert came home one evening with a man I had not met before, a business associate, he said, a man with whom he had made an arrangement. He had me serve them supper, and then he told me to take Thomas to bed early, and then he told me to come back down to the parlor. The man's name was Gerald Fitch. He was perhaps 50, prosperous-looking. Robert explained the arrangement to me across the parlor table, while Gerald Fitch sat there saying nothing. Robert had debts, substantial debts, accumulated in what he called investments, but which I understood from context had more to do with cards than commerce. Gerald Fitch had purchased those debts. The terms of the arrangement Robert had made were not financial. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I do not say. I want to be accurate. What I will say is this. I understood what was being asked of me. I understood it clearly. I looked at my husband across that parlor table while a stranger sat between us, and I understood that the man I had married, the man who had argued pleasantly with me about Thackeray versus Dickens in a church social 12 years earlier, had reduced me to a line item in a financial negotiation. That was the moment. That was the all at once. Not the first moment he had treated me as something less than a person, but the moment I understood that there was no floor, that I had been wrong all those years, to believe there was a level below which he would not go. There was no level. There was no floor. I will not tell you what happened that night. I will tell you what happened afterward. What happened afterward was that I took Thomas out of his bed at 2 a.m, wrapped him in his coat, put on my own coat and the boots I kept by the door, took the money from the household account that I had been carefully, quietly, secretly putting aside in small amounts for over a year because some part of me had known, even before I could have told you what I knew. And I walked out of Robert Sayers' house with my 8-year-old son, and I did not look back, not once, not at the house, not at the life, not at the version of myself that had lived there for 11 years, carefully adapting, carefully surviving, while something essential was being worn away. I walked, and I did not look back. What followed was 3 years that I will compress here, because the details of them are their own story and not the story I am telling today. We went to my mother first. She was still alive, still in the same house, my father having died of his habits 2 years before, a fact I received with neither grief nor satisfaction, just a kind of grim recognition that the world had made one small correction. My mother took us in. She was thin, and her arm was still crooked, and she was 55 years old and looked 70, and she held Thomas on her lap for an hour without saying anything, and then she looked at me and said, with complete simplicity, that we would manage. We managed. It was not easy managing. A woman leaving her husband in 1874 was not a woman the world was designed to accommodate. I could not access what Robert owned because it was not mine by law. I could not easily find work that would support myself and a child because the work available to women of my station was domestic work, and domestic work paid barely enough for one person and nothing like enough for two, and besides I could not take Thomas with me into a household position, and I was not leaving Thomas anywhere. We took in washing. We took in sewing. My mother's neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Carroll, had a small trade in alterations, and let me work alongside her in exchange for a portion of what came in. I did this for 2 years. I learned to be very good at invisible mending. It is a particular skill, invisible mending, making something damaged look whole again. I thought about that sometimes while I worked. The metaphor was not subtle. Robert did not come after me. I had been afraid he would, had planned for it, had a kind of cold, detailed plan worked out in my head for what I would say and do if he appeared. But he didn't appear. I heard through Louisa, who heard through others, that he had moved, gone west as he had always planned. Whether he told people he had a wife and son he had left behind, or whether he constructed some other story for himself, I don't know. I expect it was the latter. He was a man who was skilled at constructing stories for himself. That was one of the things I had admired about him once, the confidence with which he narrated his own life, the way he could look at what had happened and describe it in whatever terms suited him. Thomas grew. Children grow regardless of what is happening around them, which is both a wonder and a kind of reproach to adults who would like to stop and grieve properly for what they've lost. Thomas grew and asked questions I answered as honestly as I could for his age, and became a child I was proud of. He was like me in his quietness and his watchfulness and his interior life that he didn't show easily. He was not like me in his essential sweetness, which must have come from somewhere neither of his parents was obviously providing. From some ancestral well of better nature, he was kind, genuinely kind. At 10 years old, at 12, he was already kinder than most adults I knew. I held on to that. On the worst nights, I held on to that. This child is in the world. This particular person with his particular sweetness exists. Whatever else has happened and whatever else will happen, that is something. That is not nothing. I need to tell you now about the thing I regret. I have been working toward it through all of this preamble, not to delay it, not to avoid it, but because I need you to understand the ground it grew from. The ground matters. The soil matters. What grows from soil soaked in that much difficulty, that much fury held in silence for that long, under those conditions. It matters what the soil was. Robert came back. That is where it begins. He came back in the spring of 1878, 15 years after we'd married, 4 years after I had walked out in the night with Thomas and his coat. He came back to Virginia on what he described, to Louisa, who saw him first, as a business trip. He had done well out west. That was apparent in how he looked. Better clothes, a solidity about him, the look of a man who had been eaten regularly and sleeping without anxiety. He had, it became clear, also remarried. A woman in Ohio, a widow with her own property. He had not divorced me. He had simply remarried on the assumption, apparently, that the distance and the years and the absence of anyone paying close attention would make this unproblematic. He wanted to see Thomas. He came to my mother's house, our house, the house where I had lived for 4 years at that point, and he knocked on the door in the early evening, and when I opened it, he was standing there looking exactly like himself, and I felt something move through me that I couldn't name at the time. Not love, not even the memory of love, something colder than that. Something that had been forming slowly over 4 years of washing other people's clothes and mending tears invisibly and managing on not enough and watching my son grow up without shoes that fit right and explaining to him over and over in ways he was just barely old enough to accept why we lived the way we lived. He said he wanted to see his son, said he had some money for the boy, for his schooling, said he had thought about us, said things had been difficult and he had made mistakes, said all the things men say when they want something and have decided that a sufficient quantity of soft language will obtain it. I told him to leave. He didn't leave. He stood in the doorway and said he had rights. He had rights. That word, in that doorway, after everything, he had rights. What I did next is the thing I have been in this place for 53 years for. I will not describe it in detail. What I will say is that I made a decision in that moment that I had been, without knowing it, building toward for 35 years. From the night I was 12 years old and lay in my bed and heard the crack of my mother's arm and did not go through the wall. From every year of silence and adapting and managing and surviving and not taking up too much room and not making a fuss and being strong and patient and steady and reliable and all the other words. It all came to a point in that moment, like a long calculation finally arriving at its answer. Thomas was 12 years old. He was in the house. That is what I regret. That is the one thing, the thing at the center of everything, the thing I have turned over in my hands for 53 years, examining every surface, every edge, every small imperfection. Not what I did to Robert. I have made my peace with that, insofar as peace is possible, and I believe I have. What he was, what he had done, the road he had put me on, I have examined all of that, and I believe what I believe about it, and I have stopped losing sleep over it specifically. That is not what haunts me. Thomas saw. He had been in the back of the house, in the room he shared with my mother, and he heard the noise, and he came through the hallway, and he saw. He was 12 years old, and he saw what his mother had done. And I watched his face change in that moment, watched something in it close, the way a window is pulled shut against weather. And I have been watching that window stay closed in my memory ever since. He was put with Louisa. They wouldn't let me speak to him during the proceedings. I saw him once in the courtroom, and he sat next to Louisa with his hands in his lap, and his face exactly as still as mine got when things were happening that I had no power to stop, and I understood that I had given him that gift of stillness in the face of chaos. I had given him that, and it had come from a place I had wanted to protect him from. And now he was using it to survive, watching his mother be taken away in front of him. And it was the same gift. It was exactly the same gift. And what I had passed down to my son was not the sweetness of him which had come from somewhere untouched, but this, the ability to be still while terrible things happened, the ability to fold pain small. I have heard from him twice in 53 years, once a letter when he was 20, a short letter carefully written telling me he was well and working and that Louisa was well. No accusation in it, no forgiveness either, just information, just the facts of his life at that moment, delivered to me like a report to a stranger. The second time was Louisa writing to tell me he had died. Fever in 1889. He was 23 years old. He had never married. Louisa said he had been a quiet man, a good worker, a careful person who didn't take up much room. I read that, and I put the letter down, and I sat for a long time without moving. 23 years old. He had 23 years. 12 of them with me in that house, watching and learning and developing that quietness, that careful not taking up of room, before I took even the rest of those years from him in a hallway. Not his life. I did not take his life, but I took the life he might have had if he had not been standing in that hallway at 12 years old. The life where his mother was someone who had managed things differently, who had found another way, who had not arrived at that answer in that moment with his son 12 years old and listening from the back of the house. That is what I regret, not Robert. Robert is the thing I am here for, and I have made my reckoning with that, and it is done. What I regret is Thomas standing in the hallway, Thomas's face changing, Thomas learning from me the final lesson I had to teach him, the one I would have given anything not to have taught. That this is what is inside people when you take enough away from them for long enough. That his mother had this inside her, that he came from this, was made partly from this, would carry the knowledge of this his whole shortened life. If I could go back to any moment, any single moment in the entire 79 years I have been alive, I would go back to the moment I heard Thomas's footsteps in the hallway, and I would say, in whatever way the going back allowed, go back. Go back to your room. Don't come through. Let this be something that happened in a part of the house you never entered, in a moment that never became part of what you know about the world, and about your mother, and about what people carry inside them when they have been quiet for too long about too much. Let me spare you this one thing. After everything else you couldn't be spared, the poverty and the fear and the father who left and the years of not enough and all of it. Let me spare you this. I couldn't. It was already done. He was already in the hallway. he had already seen. I am old now, the oldest woman in this part of the building. The others look at me sometimes with a kind of uncertain respect, not for what I did, which most of them know, but for the simple endurance of having been here this long, for still being present, for having not disappeared. There is a kind of respect people extend to things that persist, regardless of what they are. Stones persist, old trees persist, old women in places like this persist. It is not the same as being admired, but it is something. I read when the light is good enough, I think when it isn't. I have thought myself over 53 years into a kind of clarity about my own life that I could not have arrived at from the outside. You need a great deal of time and nowhere to go with your thoughts before you can look at yourself that honestly. Most people never get that particular combination of gifts. I did not want them, but I have tried to use them. What I have arrived at, after all this thinking, is this. The fury I carried from childhood was real. It was justified. It was a reasonable response to unreasonable conditions. But it was mine to manage, and the ways I managed it, or failed to manage it, were also mine. Not Robert's, not my father's, not the world's, though the world made me what it made me. Mine. At some point, a person becomes responsible for what they carry and what they do with it, regardless of how it came to be there. I believe that. I have believed it for a long time, and I believe it still sitting here in this room with my bad knee and my white hair and my 53 years of consequence. I think about Thomas every day. Not the Thomas who stood in the hallway. The Thomas who sat on my mother's lap for an hour after we walked out of Robert's house in the night. The Thomas who asked questions I tried to answer honestly. The Thomas who was genuinely kind in a way that had not come from me, and that I had somehow not managed to destroy before I destroyed everything else. I think about what he might have become, what that sweetness might have grown into, given enough time and enough room. 23 years was not enough time. It was not enough room. He deserved more. He deserved so much more. That is what I carry, not the stone I described at the beginning. I called it a stone because that was the closest word I had, but it isn't a stone. Stones are inert. Stones just sit there. What I carry is alive. It has been alive for 53 years, growing and changing, and sometimes, in the early years, threatening to consume everything from the inside out. I have learned to live alongside it, to carry it without being destroyed by it. That is all I have managed in the end. Not absolution, not peace, exactly. Just the ability to carry it and continue. To wake up each morning and be present to the day and the light when it's good enough for reading and the thoughts when it isn't. If anyone reads this, if any young person, any person standing at the beginning of a life and not yet understanding what they contain, what fury and love and capacity are stored in them, waiting, reads this, I want to say only this. Learn what you carry. Learn it early, before circumstances teach it to you in a way you cannot undo. Find what the fury is and where it lives and what it needs from you before it demands things you cannot take back. I did not know what I contained. I knew it was there. I had felt it for 35 years, but I did not know its dimensions, did not know how far it reached. If I had known, I would have been more afraid of it, and I think the fear in that case would have been the right response. Thomas, that is the one thing, the only thing. After everything that was done and everything that was taken and everything that was survived and everything that was lost, it is always Thomas in the hallway. It is always that window closing in his face. It is always the thing I could not unsee and could not spare him from and cannot go back and change. That is what I carry. That is what I will carry until I put it down for the last time and it is over. That is my greatest failure, my deepest regret. The one thing I can't fix now. Too late, always too late.